and not much else. I had two nagging issues that bothered me for years. One was the Hoffman affair. We've already talked about that. Why would the church buy these things and hide them? And then the other thing was the infinite and eternal atonement of Jesus Christ. I never could get my mind around that. How other people on other worlds would have to believe in the extraterrestrial Jesus, and they wouldn't have any frame of reference for the Roman rule or the Jewish traditions that went with his ministry. How would that work? That seemed like a very dismal condition for all the numberless worlds out there. They have to believe on Christ on this planet. I waited for 25 years for that doctrine to be changed or to be clarified, to no avail, of course. So I had two events that really kicked off my research. I was running at 5 o'clock in the morning in Mesa, Arizona, training for a marathon, and my running partner said that she just read the book Under the Banner of Heaven, and there were some really weird things about Mormonism in there. And she said, are these things true? How could they possibly be true? Mormonism is such a well-respected religion. How could they possibly be true? And I said, well, I hadn't heard about these things either, about Joseph Smith's multiple wives, the Mount Meadow Massacre, being ordered by this, and all these things. But I'll read it, I'll research it, and I'll get back to you. Well, 2 weeks later, we had the Lamborn family reunion. These are all my brothers, my sister, and my mom in the middle. And the Lamborn reunion is kind of maybe a little different. We usually have a work project at some point in the family reunion, and this work project was in Brigham City with my brother. We had some apartments there, needed to have some work done. So we went down, and of course it was the men that were going to be there to work. And after we took a break, we sat around and we talked about the emerging information that was coming out, and that some of us had done some research and found that the church wasn't all that had been taught to us all these years, that there were some skeletons there that need to be investigated. And we agreed that we'd help each other, we'd exchange ideas, and we'd recommend good books that were objective and fair, and we would proceed to really do the most important investigation of our lives. At least I thought it was the most important investigation of my life. I also made a conscious decision that I would never keep anything secret. I would tell my wife what I was reading, invite her to join me. If anybody asked me at church, I'd tell them. I took books, Grant Palmer's book, to church, read it during sacrament meeting. No Man Knows My History. I took it to church and read it. And I was never in the closet, not with my family, not with my church or priesthood leaders. That was a conscious decision. And I took this like a college course. I wrote book reports. I'm really anal that way. I wrote book reports for nobody, for myself. And I documented the key things I found out, the key threads that I thought were important. I summarized them myself so I could refer to them over and over again as I did more and more research and add to it. So I kept a record for myself, basically, for nobody else. This was the most important investigation of my life, and I wanted to get it right. Well, at this time, I was released as scoutmaster, and they made me the high priest, one of the high priest group instructors, ironically. Okay, and so, as many of you related, the things I was learning outside the normal curriculum started to creep into my lessons. The first one was on the Book of Abraham, and I said, well, how many of you are aware that the Book of Abraham papyri were discovered in 1967 in a museum in New York? And there were about 40 brethren there, and I had, I think, 4 hands raised. So about 10% knew about that they'd been discovered. I said, how many of you knew that church had them translated and they had nothing to do with Abraham, and that it was just regular funerary documents that would have been buried with any mummy? Anybody know anything about that? And can you help me? I said, I have a friend that really has a problem with this, and I was trying to help him, and I don't know what to do. So I had a good friend, who's still my good friend, by the way. He approached me afterwards and gave me a book, which I read, and I also read by his own hand upon papyrus for a balance, and of course I drew my own conclusions based on all the evidence. The next lesson was on Joseph Smith, so I printed out the list of his wives off of FamilySearch.org, And I printed off Zina Huntington's, that she was already married, and I printed off Helen Mark Kimball, that her age was 14 at the time of the marriage. I took that to the high priest group, and I said, by show of hands, how many of you know that Joseph Smith had other wives in this life and was married to them before he died, and that they were living at the time and everything? And then I had, out of about 25 brethren in that meeting, I had 2 hands. So again, just about 10% knew that he had a polygamous life. He lived a polygamous life. And I said, well, how many of you knew he married a 14-year-old? No hands. How many of you knew that he married women that were already married to other men that were still living, and I passed around the sheets, which they looked at with much interest? Okay. And there were no hands. Okay, so nobody knew about the 14-year-old or that he was married to women that were already married. And I says, this is all familysearch.org. You can go home and look it up yourselves. And I printed these from the church's own website. And I had brethren approach me after those lessons, both of them, and thank me. But it was always in the hallway, in the dark corners of, but they really did appreciate it. And I could tell that they were speaking from their heart. So I thought I was doing the right thing by sharing these things. Well, my last lesson that I taught in the 3-hour block, the lesson was on truth and testimony. Okay, of course, this was a major issue for me. And so being a math professor, I proved the Pythagorean theorem for them as real simple proof, geometrical proof. A squared plus b squared equals c squared, right triangle law. And I said, okay, we've examined this, we've proven it logically. We could say, I think with very high confidence, that this is truth and we know that it's true. And everybody agreed. I said, how would you compare that to a 5-year-old who gets up in testimony meeting and says, I know Joseph Smith is a prophet of God, okay? Well, everybody agreed that probably very low probability, and that's really not something that the child could know of a certainty. I said, well, how about a 30-year-old that gets up and says, I know the Book of Mormon is the Word of God and a historically accurate work? Well, the brethren said, well, yeah, we think that's possible. I said, okay, well, you think that's really possible. Well, consider this. And then I told him the story of B.H. Roberts and his issues that he had back in 1922 and his in-depth research into the language and the animals and the crops and the anthropology and everything else, all their problems. And he went to the most knowledgeable people in the world to get the answers, the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. And when he related all this information to the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, they were visibly shaken. They were crying. They realized that they'd been hoodwinked. And so, brethren, I saw the same thing in the high priest group when I was describing all this stuff, and I told them about the book View of the Hebrews and how there's ample information that paralleled the Book of Mormon. And anyway, I had some brethren that were looking pretty sad at that point. And by the way, the stake president was in the front row. And the stake president took issue with my discussion, obviously, and we had to agree to disagree in the end. So it just so happened that 9 days after my last lesson, I had my temple recommend interview coming up. And my bishop was not there at the lesson, the high priest group lesson that day, and I apparently was unaware of the lesson. So he was totally unaware when he asked the question, do you have a firm testimony, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, well, I'm having some very serious reservations about the restoration through Joseph Smith and the historicity of the Book of Mormon. I have some really problems right now understanding those things and reconciling those things. And he was floored. But it was really interesting to hear his reaction. Let me describe it to you. His first reaction was, but look at everything we've worked for, Lyndon. Okay? So this is the escalation of commitment bias he was playing on, right? Yeah. The sacrifice trap. Everything we poured our hearts and minds into for the last, umpteen years of our lives, you're saying is not real. His next tactic was also very interesting. He said, you know, Lyndon, smarter men than you have done all this research, and they've all decided the church is true. Okay, so authority bias, right? And attacking my pride, pointing the finger. You're prideful because you think you're smarter than the Hugh Nibleys of the world. You know, and I told him I'd read Hugh Nibley and his explanations on the Book of Abraham, and I'm never going to believe any authority of the church ever again, Bishop. I told him that flat out. He says, I need to make my own choices, my own decision based on my own intelligence, because Hugh Nibley is full of BS. Anyway, so his next tactic, what sins are you concealing from me, Lyndon?